All right, welcome everyone to the City Club for our presentation today. We are fortunate to have with us Connie Baxter Marlow and Andrew Cameron Bailey over here behind the camera. We'll be in front of the camera in just a bit. Their book, The Trust Frequency, which I'm in the middle of reading and very much enjoying, 10 Assumptions for a New Paradigm. I'd suggest looking into this book. It's really great. There's a few copies out front here. The book synthesizes indigenous cosmology, quantum science, and Western and Eastern mysticism into a guidebook for understanding the conscious, loving, abundant nature of the universe. They've spent over a decade researching the Pilgrim story in England, Holland, Plymouth, and Cape Cod. They've spent over 2 decades with visionary indigenous elders in the United States, Mexico, and Africa. They currently are working on a book and documentary film and screenplay project that brings honor to both the Mayflower Pilgrims and the Indians they lived amongst for the beginnings of American democracy and the American mind and spirit during the first 50 years of peace and friendship at Plymouth Plantation. They see the American democratic experiment as an important step in the evolution of consciousness and feel that humanity stands on a threshold where our choices today will determine the outcome. So welcome, Connie and Andrew.
Thank you, Roger.
So hi, everybody.
Hello,
Welcome.
everybody.
And this is our first time using a PowerPoint. So we'll see how it goes. And we're big picture thinkers, and we're going to give you a big picture today. And a lot of information that we're going to touch on, and we're happy to give you more information if you're interested. We have a lot of information we can send you if you sign up outside. We have a lot of it digitally if you want to pursue this, because it's a very interesting subject that's very much enmeshed in misinformation and misunderstanding. And that is the first 50 years at Plymouth Plantation and the beginnings of America and the relationship of the Mayflower Pilgrims specifically and the Indians they lived amongst, but also the whole English settlement of New England. So we're going to start with, we want to say something?
Sure. So I think a lot of conscious Americans at this point are aware that a lot of what we've come to understand about Thanksgiving, the first Thanksgiving, are really sort of mythological. Am I right? You know, certain of the things such as cranberry sauce or turkeys, on and on, are not based on what really happened on that day in the fall of 1621. So a part of what we're going to present here will be dealing with those mythological factors, the things that are not necessarily true or have even possibly been distorted for various reasons about the facts surrounding the first Thanksgiving and the relationship between those folks who came off the Mayflower in 1620 and the Indians they met 4 months later in 1621, and the ensuing relationship that lasted for 54 years of unbroken peace and friendship, unprecedented, an extraordinary, a treaty that was sustained by both sides for 54 years, over half a century. I think that's pretty extraordinary. Now, if you look at this picture up on the screen, that's not what it looked like at the time. That's sort of what's come down to us. Here are these beautifully dressed pilgrims, and among them are a few native people, and the reality was exceedingly different, including the fact that the English were outnumbered by the natives by 5 to 1 approximately. There were many, many more native people who showed up at that event than there were white people. Not terribly important, but you know, it just gives you an example. So just for the sheer fun of it, here's another possible, is this what it looked like? No, it wasn't a Batman scene. So, okay.
But we were just out in New England. We've been there for 6 months, and the turkeys abound out there. Wild turkeys are everywhere, and cranberry bogs exist out there, and the squash and all that. You know, the traditional meal is in fact reminiscent of what was available there at that time.
So the reason for showing this truly silly picture is just to show that there are lots of truly silly pictures we could show. And we're not going to do that because we don't have time to do that. But the belief system surrounding Thanksgiving, as the older ones among us were taught back in school, is pretty close to the historical story. And then revisionist history stepped in. And now there are extraordinary, outrageous misbeliefs, which we'll deal with very briefly toward the end, because that's not the focus of what we're talking about today. What we're looking for is the higher perspective on what was going on at the time. The 1600s were a time of extraordinary transformation for humanity, or at least for European and Native American humanity. During the 1600s, so much change occurred.
And we're talking about this all in the context of the transformation of consciousness of humanity, that evolutionary upward spiral that has taken place in periodic steps by certain individuals, certain circumstances that have taken humanity up a notch. And so we're looking at it in that perspective because the Mayflower Pilgrims took a huge step forward for humanity. Very few people understand who these people are and what they did, and the courage that drove them. And so we're giving you this whole thing in this perspective, and then the role of the Native American that they met in America and what came out of it. And we're going to be showing the context of the what we call the trust frequency, okay? And the founding of America, the vision of within the context of a providence-based paradigm, a creator-based paradigm, okay? The Native Americans have a creator-based paradigm. The founders of America, the 1776 guys, had a providence-based paradigm. If you read their writings, you'll find that everything they did, they turned over to providence. They did everything they could and turned it over to providence. This is very prevalent in the writings of the drafters of the Constitution and those guys in 1776. And the Mayflower Pilgrims were epiphany-based. They knew that they were getting instructions from a higher power and put their lives on the line for that knowledge that they were receiving. And we've got some information, the specific information that we'll share with you on that. So we're bringing in the context of our individual free will today, of what we're going to do with our lives and how we're going to keep it going, keep this evolutionary upward spiral going. It's up to us to do that. And that's why we're sharing this information with the idea of inspiring people today to move to a higher level. And that's within the context of our understanding that we are in the midst of an evolutionary leap in consciousness. This is bigger than any of us, this shift, and it's up to each of us individually how we will participate in it with our choices on a day-to-day basis. So
I would say that has something to do with the mission, as I understand it, of the Highlands Institute, which is about the future of humanity and how we're going to get to a positive future for humanity. And what we're suggesting here is that there's something that can both teach us and inspire us from the past, from this event 400 years ago.
how'd that shift?
I don't know.
Yeah. So go on.
So we are, as you can tell, new to PowerPoint, first one we ever made. It's a lot of fun. And so a part of this has to do with the founding of this experimental society of which we are all a part. Now, I want to say something about me personally, because 45 years ago, this Thursday, Thanksgiving, I first set foot on the American soil on Thanksgiving of 1969. I had sailed across the Atlantic. I think I can legitimately claim to be a Latter-day Pilgrim. I came under sail, I let the wind blow me, and it's a sort of serious anniversary for me this Thursday. Every Thanksgiving is kind of important. I was born in England, grew up in South Africa, left South Africa in the midst of the apartheid era, came over heading for Northern California. Something was going on there that had to do with consciousness, cosmic consciousness, which has been my search, which puts me where I am today. And I didn't know anything about Thanksgiving other than I'd heard of it. It's this exclusively American celebration, this festivity, and it's really my absolutely favorite American holiday. And then later I discovered that when going to Plymouth, Massachusetts, that there's another side to the story, that the Native Americans in particular have an exceedingly different take on the first Thanksgiving, and they have real trouble celebrating Thanksgiving for that reason. We'll touch on that just a little bit.
So this whole context of this American democratic experiment that was brought, the ideas, the kernels of the ideas were brought on the Mayflower by the Mayflower Pilgrims. And we'll show you some documents that they drafted and the ideas that they brought. And these ideas are the consent of the governed, self-determination, the separation of church and state, equal and just laws serving the common good, and liberty and justice and abundance for all. That's what our troops are out defending, supposedly. That's what we all dream for our children. That's what humanity basically dreams. All of humanity dreams of that for their children. And we feel that it is in jeopardy now, that we all need to stand up and be counted as far as really living these principles and bringing them to pass. And we feel that it has to do with a higher level of being and understanding. And that's what our Trust Frequency book has to do with, and that has to do with bringing us into a higher understanding so that we can move into this American dream. But it really is the birthright of all of humanity. It's just that we're not going to go into it in depth, but we feel it has to do with frequency. It has to do with where we're operating, what frequency we're operating on right now, and that we can lift to a higher frequency where, in fact, the laws are different and this dream can come true. So we'll carry on. So within the context of the 1600s, we're talking about the Mayflower Pilgrims at this point, and who they were and what the environment was in which they took this step for humanity.
So the 1600s is possibly the least, I don't think it's the least studied but era in recent history. But there's an extraordinary shortage of literature, for example. How many novels, for example, can you name that were written that took place during the 1600s? And what happened during the 1600s? Well, as we say right here, a bifurcation, a split, a fork in the road occurred between the integrated religious or spiritual mind and the rational, what became the materialist reductionist mindset that came out of Newton and Descartes and Darwin. Science sets out to this day to separate us from, or shall we say there's now a split between science and spirituality. There's a split between physics and metaphysics. And that's my personal field. It's the place where I love to explore that sort of blurry, fuzzy boundary between physics and metaphysics. Physics being that which we think we know, and metaphysics being that which we think we don't know. And I notice I qualify it in that way. A split occurred in the human psyche that has troubled us ever since. I think we've become sort of schizophrenic, disturbed people as a result of what occurred at that time. 400 years ago. And we are now at the place where the next major shift is in process. And the idea, I think, is that there's an integration going on. We're at the end of the age, what I might call the age of analysis, breaking it all apart, looking at the bits and pieces. Now we're at the reassembly stage, the age of synthesis. It's time to reinvent ourselves, and none too soon, judging by what one reads in the newspapers.
So these separatists, these who we call pilgrims now, they were in England during an absolute monarchy. It was against the law not to go to church in England, okay? And so they had a sense, the Bible had been translated into English, and it was on their tables for the first time, on the kitchen table. They could talk about it, they could discuss it. It wasn't just relegated to the church people telling them what was in the Bible. Well, what they discovered was that God intended us to have a direct relationship with Him, okay? So they realized that the Church of England was inappropriate, it was not true Christianity, and the Puritan movement wanted to purify the Church of England, wanted to get rid of all the ritual and stuff that had developed through the ages. And these separatists realized that there was no way they were going to be able to purify the Church of England. They had to separate from it. Many of them were clergy, pastors in the church. They lost their jobs. They had to meet in secret, and the king found out about this and pursued them and persecuted them, and it became untenable for them to stay in England. These were moms, dads, and kids, okay? This was you, me, and our kids saying, hey, guess what? No, it's not okay. We're not going to allow you to usurp our divine right to be who we want, live by our conscience, which they knew had to do with a direct connection to the divine. They were epiphany-based, okay? So they knew that when they had these experiences, that they were connecting to something, a power bigger than all of us. And so they ultimately met and they formed the Scrooby Covenant, okay?
Has anybody heard of Scrooby, England? It's nothing to do with Scooby-Doo. Nothing whatsoever. It's a little town in Nottinghamshire in northern England, and it's where this entire thing began. There are now something like 35 million Americans who are descended from the Mayflower Pilgrims. Isn't that an extraordinary number? They were prolific. Connie's ancestors, she's a descendant, had 11 kids, and everybody else followed suit. And boy, does that add up quickly.
Yeah, John and Priscilla Alden are my great-great-great-great-great-grandparents who had 11 children.
So just quickly to run through it, the movement started in the late 1500s at Cambridge. This came out of an intellectual group of thinkers who were basically rethinking philosophy, rethinking religion, making some major discoveries, and making these decisions to separate. And ultimately that meant they had to leave England. Long, crazy, dramatic, harrowing story. They got out of England, they literally had to escape, took them several attempts. They got to Holland, where they found a much more tolerant atmosphere. They were allowed to worship and act according to their personal conscience.
So they met in the Scrooby Manor in Scrooby, England, on the sly. It was a manor that had received the king's people, and the William Brewster, who was living at the Scrooby Manor, his father had been in service to the king. So these aren't ruffians. These are respected members of English society. They were farmers. They were of various levels. So they met and formed this Scrooby Covenant, which is an agreement that they made amongst themselves. And I'll just read it here.
Think about it as rebels. Look at that first sentence there. What's the king going to think of that? As ye lords, free people.
Read the whole thing.
In the context of a country where you were the kings, not free people. Okay?
So, as ye lords, free people, joined themselves by a, so this is a description of it, written about it. As ye lords, free people, joined themselves by a covenant of the Lord into a church estate, in ye fellowship of ye gospel, to walk in all his ways, made known, or to be made known to them, according to their best endeavor, whatever it should cost them, the Lord assisting them.
So these folks were willing to die for their religious beliefs. Extraordinary. Pretty extraordinary.
And what it says here, we're friends with a Pilgrim scholar. In fact, we just interviewed him for our film, and he makes the point that what this says is his ways made known to them and yet to be made known to them. That they didn't feel they knew everything. They just knew that they were being guided by the hand of God, and that they had a job to do. So, and if you really look at this, I live a spirit-guided life, okay? It's worth dying for. I've told people, my children, whatever, when you live a spirit-guided life, you have to be that committed to listening and going with your intuition, with your own knowing and your vision. So I saw immediately, when I discovered these Mayflower Pilgrims, which was in 1998, I saw that they lived a spirit-guided life. I saw the relationship of the life I live and what they were doing. Theirs is all framed in the context of God and those terms. But if you strip it from that, I think that probably everybody in this room would identify with what is driving these people. And what I realized, because I've lived with Native Americans, spent extensive time with visionary Native Americans over the past 30 years, is that the Native American way of life and cosmology is a creator-based cosmology. It has this direct connection with the divine. And when someone goes up on a mountain to seek a vision, when he gets the word, the voice speaks to him, he comes down and tells his people that is the dominant force for that tribe, for that clan, for whatever. Anything that preceding that disappears. And off they go on to this, well, you got the message, let's go. So we're seeing these parallels that others may not be able to see, and that's what we're bringing to the table at this time, is basically the spiritual alignment of the Mayflower Pilgrim and the Indian they lived amongst. So,
Excellent.
yeah, so what did we?
I'm going back.
Yeah,
go
so
back?
let's see if we cover, we pretty much covered that.
Yeah.
Let's see, the radical shift in consciousness,
Yeah.
okay.
Right.
So we're moving right along.
So one of the most extraordinary unfoldments in the 1600s, the 17th century, was the movement that became a worldwide movement from monarchy. The previous era was a pretty universal monarchy. There were kings, there were rajas, there were shahs, there were whatever you called them. They were kings and they were in charge of everything, and they basically owned the populace, right? The movement to democracy, it's not unrealistic to say that the Mayflower carried the seeds of what became American democracy. And at the same time, obviously, Europe was beginning to move in that same direction. The Protestant Reformation was well underway with Luther and Calvin. It pretty much did come out of religion. But then later you have the American Revolution, you have the French Revolution. You have all of these different experiments in human society. How do we structure ourselves? What's the best way to live? And right now I think we're asking ourselves, what's the best, because we really have not lived up to the highest principles that have been presented. We've come up with some beautiful visions. Have we put them into effect? I don't think so. I don't think we've got there yet, but I hold out hope for humanity, that we can get somewhere we have not yet gone. So these ideas started as far back as 1215 with the Magna Carta. It only lasted a very brief time. It was an English vision of a different way. It was crushed immediately by the Pope, who eliminated it, triggering a major civil war. But that was an attempt that the English did not forget, but they were under the thumb of the Pope, and the government was dissolved by Rome, and there was nothing they could do about it at that time, but driving something underground often makes it stronger. At almost the same time, we had the Iroquois, what are known as the Iroquois, the confederacy here, where an extraordinary and ongoing, to this day, experiment in a democratic way of structuring your society was happening on this side of the ocean. We had the Scrooby Covenant we just mentioned, which is actually a major document of freedom. And then the Mayflower arrives. And on November 11th, before coming ashore, the Mayflower Covenant, widely regarded as the first document of democracy, was drafted and signed by the people of the Mayflower before landing, because they very much knew they needed to have a set of rules for their behavior before they landed, because there was right on board the ship the potential for problems.
And it was, a covenant.
That's called the Mayflower Compact, which is an outgrowth really of the Scrooby Covenant.
It was also called a combination, but that's a...
Then in 1621, on the spring equinox of 1621, when the Pilgrims, the 54 people who survived that first winter, because half of them died, probably of scurvy, pneumonia. It was a freezing cold winter, and anyway, it's a well-known fact that half of them died. They met the Indians in the spring, and on the day they met, they sat down and crafted and drafted a treaty that was honored for more than half a century. For the ensuing 54 years, both the Mayflower people and the Pokanoket group of Indians who crafted this agreement between the two groups, both sides honored that treaty impeccably. It's very interesting that that was done, and that's perhaps not widely known. So that resulted in an intercultural harvest celebration at the end of that first summer. It resulted in...
Well, which was what we're here today
which is Thanksgiving. I just wanted to run really quickly through the timeline. 1621 to 1675, a really good period of intercultural cooperation that's just about unprecedented. I'm not sure historically what other examples we have of that. It's really special. And fast forwarding to the 1700s, we get to the Albany Plan, where the United States, as it begins to form itself, starts to look at the native people, specifically the Iroquois Constitution. How did those people function so effectively for hundreds of years? And they're still functioning effectively. What did they do to do that? And they actually created a constitution that's contributed to the American Constitution. Finally, the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, all of which can be traced all the way back to Cambridge, England in the late 1500s, and the Scrooby Covenant in 1606.
And we'll go into those a little bit more in a few minutes.
Yeah. So we are pretty aware of the history of the Mayflower so-called Pilgrims, those English people, those separatists who left England, got to Holland. There were circumstances in Holland that were, we won't go into that in depth, but it was time for them to leave, and they chose to cross the Atlantic and come to what was then called Virginia, the northern parts of Virginia. Virginia was simply the only English colony, and its northern extent was roughly New York, the Hudson River. But if we really want to understand this, we need to understand native New England before the Mayflower. So what do we do with that? What information do we have? Where do we get it from? What original source material is there? Well, I've done an awful lot of research on that in the last several years, and very intensively the last 6 months on the East Coast. And it's quite a story. And if you like, you can start in, God, when was that? In the 1500s with Irish monks in leather boats making it across the Atlantic and showing up. Around about AD 1000, the Vikings. There's no question from the Viking sagas that were written in the 1300s, but they were oral traditions before that handed down. The Vikings made it across the Atlantic, attempted colonization. Unsuccessfully, they were eventually chased out by the indigenous people. And the Vikings were pretty tough, as I think we know. Sometime, the date's not clear, sometime between the year 1000 and the year maybe 1400, the great peacemaker, the story of Hiawatha, the coming together of the 5 warring tribes forming themselves into what we call the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee Confederacy, including the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Onondaga, etc. And during that time, from then on, the Europeans began to show up in increasing numbers in the form of early explorers. Verrazano, who do we have? We have Verrazano, Cartier, Champlain, Gosnold, who was English, John Smith, the famous John Smith, and numerous others, as well as a lot of ships of fishermen and traders. Fur trading began somewhere in there. They discovered the extraordinary fishing off the east coast of the United States or present-day Canada. So contact had occurred. Between 1609 and 1615, a little-known historical fact. The present-day Massachusetts was a purely Native American phenomenon, and it was organized under something we could call the Massachusetts Confederacy. That is not known because this stable relationship between the native people was destroyed as a result of something that happened way up to the north. It had to do with competition, intertribal competition for fur trading with the French that ended up influencing the entire eastern seaboard that nobody knows about. And it actually, the destructive force was something that is known as the Tarleton's War. And Tarleton does not sound like the name of an Indian tribe, does it? And it's not. It's actually taken from one of the leaders of the tribe who the French called maybe Tarantou or something like that. The English ended up calling them the Tarentines. Anyway, there's a war which is, again, pretty much unknown. I have asked serious historians. For example, one of the chief gentlemen at Plymouth Plantation, present-day Plymouth Plantation, I said, "What do you know about the Tarleton's War?" He said, "The what?" Okay, he's a serious history buff on this subject. The Tarleton's War is one of the most significant events in pre-Mayflower New England history. It's not known. The final factor that is known is that there was an epidemic. There was an epidemic of some sort that devastated or decimated the native people. I think that's very well known, right? It was long thought to be smallpox. It was not smallpox, as it turns out. It was thought to have been brought by the English. It was not brought by the English, as it turns out. And my thesis, I'll say it once and once only, is that it arrived in Massachusetts Bay Area in the context of the Tarleton's War, which consisted of seafaring warriors coming down from the north and bringing the disease with them. And my current research tells me that the disease was a form of plague, not bubonic, but pneumonic plague, airborne plague, which had arrived in England from China in the previous century and century and a half and through Europe, and took out as many as 6 out of 10 Londoners, for example. So it's really interesting looking at the big picture, because if you're just looking at Plymouth, here are the people who were there and things happened to them. Warriors arrived from elsewhere that they had nothing to do with and proceeded to attack them. And then these horrific diseases that again arrived completely, there was no way for the local people to know what was hitting them. Profound events that resulted in the elimination of up to 90% of the native people of coastal New England before the Mayflower arrived. Had that not been the case, Connie Baxter Marlow here would not be here. Her boat would have landed. They could not have survived with the previous population situation. It just was. The reason they survived is they landed at a place called Patuxet by the Indians. The Patuxet people were gone. They were wiped out. You've probably heard of Squanto. He was one of the few survivors. He survived because he'd been kidnapped by an English slave trader, taken to Europe, and finally made his way back in 1619. He was kidnapped in 1614, was away for all of these terrible things I was just telling you about, and made it back in 1619 when it was all over, actually liking the English, actually speaking English, and becoming the true helper of the Mayflower people. Without Squanto, it would have been exceedingly difficult for them.
So from the perspective of this covenant, these ideas coming across the waters and landing here, if you look at it from a higher perspective, this amazing Squanto story, there was an Indian here who spoke English, who could communicate, and Plymouth was empty. They weren't taking anybody's land. There was nobody there to claim ownership of the land. So if you look at it from a higher perspective, there's really beautiful circumstantial evidence for a higher power at work.
Or at least that's the way they would have seen it, because they were daily praying to God to guide them and to support them and to help them. And they had just gone through a horrific winter with the loss of half of their members. Imagine their emotional state when they meet their first Indians and one of them turns out to speak English and had therefore the ability to communicate with Massasoit, the leader of the nearest tribe, and therefore to craft the treaty we were talking about. How could they have done that if they didn't have language to communicate?
So what we've got here right now is to tell you a little more about the Iroquois Great Law, of what was going on American soil. And I just wanted to read to you a little something that'll give you a sense of it, because you probably don't have a sense of what this was all about and how it participated in this evolution of American democracy. And let's see, war raged for generations 1,000 years ago around the Great Lakes and present-day upstate New York. The Peacemaker and Hiawatha bravely marched into the middle of the battle. No one harmed the holy men, but the warriors at first did not stop fighting. Armed only with logic, reasoning, and their spiritual message, they conducted condolence ceremonies with the battle-worn warriors. They convinced the original 5 Iroquoian nations, one by one, to make peace and to unite as the Iroquois Confederacy. The Peacemaker then unveiled a new form of government, participatory democracy, and a legal system called the Great Law of Peace. The core teaching of the Great Law is that peace was the law and the law was for peace. Under the Great Law, 50 chiefs and clan mothers were organized in a 3-part system of government with executive, legislative, and judicial divisions. The Onondaga Nation became like an executive branch. The legislative branch was formed when the Mohawk and Seneca were organized like the U.S. Senate, and the Oneida and Cayuga, later joined by the Tuscarora, formed a sort of U.S. House of Representatives. The judicial branch of government was turned over to the clan mothers. Thus, the women gained veto power over war and the power to nominate the chiefs. So that just gives you a sense of something extraordinary that happened on this land before the Pilgrims had arrived, and it was during this time in Europe that this urge for freedom was coming forth. So we're making the point that it's a universal desire to be free, the evolution of the free mind, our birthright to be free, autonomous, sovereign beings ultimately. once we get into a higher way of thinking and a higher way of being. So I just wanted to share that. And so we've got the Mayflower coming over, carrying these ideas that originated in Europe. So we're just showing the evolution of these ideas. They land on Plymouth Rock, which is...
And here's another wondrous myth. There was no such thing as Plymouth Rock. They did not land on a rock. The ladies, beautifully dressed, were not in the rowboat as they came ashore. It wasn't like that at all. However, these are the beautiful mythological events surrounding Thanksgiving and the origin story of this country that have come down to us. And some of them are completely harmless. I mean, it's okay. We can have a rock. You know, today this Thursday, there are going to be hundreds and hundreds of people going to Plymouth, Massachusetts, and going and looking down at this rock that has the numbers 1620 inscribed on the rock. The rock was elsewhere. It's not important, but it's a symbol. I think these symbols have immense power.
And a symbol of the rock of the foundation of America.
Right.
Which is a cool symbol. Once we get it, that something important happened here that we have yet to bring to fruition. And also, what it's important to know is that these people landed in November in New England. It was a mini ice age. The temperatures were a couple of degrees below normal. It was raining sleet. It was snowing. And they had to anchor. The harbor wasn't deep enough for the Mayflower to come in, so they had to anchor out and bring in their shallops and walk the last bit with all their heavy clothing, etc. So it's just really important to understand what they came into and what they survived during those first few months, and why many of them died that first winter, including my great grandparents, who had brought their daughter Priscilla, who survived and married John Alden. So
three significant events are worth just noting quickly. One being the signing of the Mayflower Compact, which was created in the cabin of the Mayflower before landing, before coming ashore at all.
And I'd like to read this to you,
okay.
so you get a sense of these ideas that were carried. This isn't the actual compact, that is another short paragraph, but I thought this really expresses their intent very well. This day, before we come to harbor, observing that some were not well affected to unity and concord, but gave appearance of faction, it was thought good that there should be an association and agreement, so that we should combine together in one body, and submit to such government and governors as we should by common consent agree to make and choose. We therefore set our hands to this that follows, word for word.
And this
Okay,
was
that's
actually
giving me the chills. I don't know
Yeah.
about you guys, but
how's that for a proclamation of democracy? And
this is
was
written
actually
in the hand
that-
of Edward Winslow, William Bradford,
and published in
1622.
London in 1622. So this is a clear historical document that we have, that we can really see what these people were thinking before they ever came ashore. Going back? Yeah.
So then there was the Wampanoag Treaty. See, we want to show you this first Thanksgiving within the context of these events. Okay, so it wasn't just, shall we argue over who invited whom and what everybody ate and what, you know? Because this is much bigger than that, than those little details. So what came next, well, after the signing of the compact, the people came ashore. They went through the winter where half of them died. And in the spring, they met their first Indian. Samoset, an Indian from Maine, came into their, where they were meeting and building their village, and said, welcome.
In English.
In English.
Surprise,
He
surprise.
spoke very broken English, and he said, I have a friend who speaks much better English. Let me go get him, Squanto. And Squanto came back with Massasoit and Massasoit's family, and they sat down and drafted what's called the Pilgrim Wampanoag Treaty.
Are you familiar with the word Wampanoag? I think a lot of people who are not New Englanders might not be. That is the present name for the local native indigenous people, who were many, many different bands and tribes. Massasoit was actually the sachem, the chief, if you will, of the Pokanoket people. And however, he was a grand sachem, which means he had some sort of authority over many of the other local bands or tribes of native people. And all of those people today are lumped under the word Wampanoag, which means people of the first light.
People of the dawn, or
People of the
first
dawn.
light.
In other words, they are the first to see the rising sun.
Which the Penobscots and the Wabanakis in Maine also claim that. So the people of the eastern seaboard are the people of the eastern gate, the people of the dawn. You know, this describes them relative to their position on Turtle Island. So this Pilgrim Wampanoag Treaty, I just wanted to read you a little about that, just to give you some real concrete, so we're not just up here, speaking abstracts. And this was on the solstice, the equinox.
The
spring equinox.
The spring equinox of 1621, which really was the first serious contact where two groups sat down in at least with good intentions and crafted an agreement as to how they could move forward in friendship.
So our messenger made a speech unto him, saying that King James saluted him with words of love and peace, and did accept of him as his ally and friend, and that our governor desired to see him and to truck with him, and to confirm a peace with him as his next neighbor. He liked well that speech, and heard it attentively, though the interpreters did not well express it. After salutations, our governor kissed his hand, and the king kissed him, and so they sat down. Then they treated of peace. And this treaty lasted for 54 years, an extraordinary coming together. So then there was, the harvest celebration. And are you familiar with the harvest celebration of what went on during that time? It wasn't just one meal that they sat down at. So I'd like to just read you this so you get a concrete idea of it. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might, after a special manner, rejoice together after we had gathered the fruit of our labors. This was in the fall of 1621, and thanks to Squanto teaching them how to plant Indian corn, which they had never seen before. They didn't have Indian corn in England. The Mayflower came laden with food, and the idea that they starved the first winter is not true at all. They had lots of food in the spring, and actually ended up feeding Indians during the summertime. But Squanto taught them how to plant corn so that by the fall they had this amazing harvest of Indian corn and other things. They, 4 in one day, killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms.
Namely, they fired off their muskets.
Many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out, and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our government, and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. They're writing this to the people back in England. This was published in 1622 as Mort's relation back in England. They're reporting back their experiences. So that gives you a sense of this context. So we better keep moving.
Yeah.
How are you guys doing? Are we overloading you?
Anyone asleep or bored yet?
Pardon?
We should break around 1:30, so about another 5 minutes.
Another 5
Okay,
minutes.
yeah.
So
We have
So-
some questions.
Huh?
We'll have some questions.
And
Yeah.
we, afterwards, what we'll
So I
do
think-
once we break is we're here. If there's anybody who would really like to engage with any of these subjects, we're here. We'd love to talk about it.
Okay, so we'd like to touch on the Plymouth paradigm, you know, what it was like during this 54 years. And this is written by Betty Booth Donahue, who is a Cherokee, who's written a book called Bradford's Indian Book. And she's showing the influence of the Native Americans on American literature. So she speaks of,
So these are sort of the basic tenets of what unfolded over the ensuing 54 years.
so she just wrote this to me the other night, and I just wanted to share it with you. Pilgrims and natives were as much alike as they were different. Both groups were highly religious, and they understood the power of the spoken word, which is her field. She's a literary
She's a
criticist.
linguist. Yeah.
The Pilgrims did not arrive with the idea of taking land from the natives. They wanted to buy it, in which they did. There was a very complex system set up for the transfer of land. They lived in close proximity to each other. Indians lived inside the stockade and came and went at will. So it was just a constant interchange. They visited with each other, exchanged ideas and information and goods, and understood each other. The Pilgrims viewed the natives as sentient human beings and valued their opinions as much as they feared their savagery. There was mutual respect. Had other colonies followed Plymouth, things would have been very different for natives and whites. Much suffering and loss of life and culture would have been avoided. So the Indians, after this all fell apart with King Philip's War, the Indians desperately wanted the Plymouth paradigm back. The Indians on the ground, I read that, the Indians said only if we could have Plymouth back, because Plymouth was absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the Puritan thing became more dominant, but the ideas of Plymouth permeated up through the Massachusetts Bay Colony and became very important in the evolution of America. So we don't have to go into that.
So during this half century, all around, things within Plymouth Colony itself, things were really rather wonderful, remarkably so. However, all around, things were shifting. What happened over the next, starting in 1630, is you had roughly 20,000 new English people come over and start what became Massachusetts Bay Colony. Okay, that created 20,000 people. That created an awful lot of pressure that was not there before. Things shifted. And there had been events down in Jamestown, the Jamestown Massacre, where the Indians, in a surprise, on a signal, totally integrated, friendly, they'd known each other for a long, long time, totally trusted, turned around in a moment on a signal and killed roughly, I think it was 427 white settlers. Only those who were warned actually by a Christianized Indian and got into the fort were able to escape, and most of those died the following winter. Very, very tough event that, of course, Plymouth became very aware of. What do you do when something like this happens? Well, they completed their fort, which they hadn't fully finished. They did that. They ended up not using it. What they did do was they kept the faith. And then there were other events, such as the Pequot Massacre, which was an example of the opposite, where the English slaughtered a large number of native people, somewhere over the number of 400 in Connecticut. The Pilgrims, Plymouth was not directly involved in that, but it happened. So there were examples of terrible behavior on both sides that were occurring around. 1642, you've got Miantonomo, who was the head of the Narragansett people, who started traveling around and giving speeches at different native communities, trying to get them to rise up and take out and to eliminate the English. He saw the threat and tried very hard to get the people behind him. He did not quite succeed with that. Here in Plymouth, we have Governor Bradford and the native leader Massasoit, who keep the peace.
So my whole thesis is that Bradford and Massasoit were visionary leaders, okay? and there's proof of this, that Massasoit was extraordinary in his leadership and who he was. So our thesis is that they met on a high level and they kept their people at this level for their lifetime. And then as pressures came on, as the passage of time and generations came forth, the children of these people didn't have that vision, didn't have that commitment to that high way of being. And things started disintegrating. And the pressure for land and all that. Andrew says Guantanamo saw the threat, the threat of numbers and pressures of land and of everything.
Yeah, in fact, there was a threat from the very, very beginning. Quite honestly, if it had not been for Massasoit agreeing to ally himself with the Pilgrims, they would have been wiped out, because there were numerous other native groups in the immediate neighborhood who said there's only one thing to do: kill them. And Massasoit had what it took to avoid that. Now, what happened in 1675 is the entire thing fell apart. King Philip's War. Now, King Philip sounds like an Englishman. He was not. He was a native. He was the son of Massasoit, who was given an English name, Philip. And this picture illustrates what unfolded there. It was the bloodiest conflict on American soil in recorded American history. I suspect there were bloodier events that happened before, but we don't have them in recorded history. It absolutely ended the peace. And quite honestly, it's tragic. And on the East Coast, we are still very much emotionally suffering from this event. It actually triggered the demise of the native peoples of New England. It really backfired on them.
And it shifted the whole thing of basically friendship, family, interchange, trust, went to mistrust, went to Indian as enemy. Okay, they didn't know who was going to slaughter whom during the war, and by the time the war ended, the whole energy had shifted. And the Indians were basically eliminated from New England and dropped out of the history books from that day forward. There was the whole Western migration and all that, but basically the Indian left our consciousness, and that's what we're bringing to the table in our work is that what the Indian is carrying for the future, for humanity, in their cosmology and in their way of knowing. So that's really the essence of why we're doing this work, because we feel that our paradigm is missing key pieces, and that the Indian and the indigenous people are carrying key pieces of an understanding of the nature of the universe that can allow us to move forward into a higher way of being.
And we really want
So
to
we should skip this stuff.
to honor the Indians for their contribution. They made a major contribution to the founding of this country. We could end it with this.
Sure.
We have a very short little 3-minute clip that tells about how we're approaching this project and what we have to, what we're working towards. So you had a question?
Yeah, I did. In all your research, are you familiar with the works of Howard Zinn?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, we'll
Yes, if
yeah.
you,
We'll-
yeah.
It paints a much different earlier picture.
Howard Zinn on the subject of Plymouth and the situation there is 100% wrong. Howard Zinn did not do his homework. Howard Zinn asked the wrong people, and there are definitely different people you can ask. If you go, for example, if you were to go to Plymouth on this Thursday and stand there above Plymouth Rock and listen to what the noise that's coming, or the sound that's coming off the stage up there through the microphones, it's an event called the National Day of Mourning, where the natives come and say all sorts of stuff that I totally respect the suffering and grieve for their suffering. But let's just tell the truth, and they do not tell the truth. And Zinn did not get it right. Sorry, but he didn't.
Well, I wasn't there, I'm just saying.
No.
Well, we're calling our work
History's battling perspectives. I'm saying that
No, I know.
share. I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong.
I love Zinn's book, The People's History. I'm always wanting to see the perspective of the underdog. However, get the facts straight, because to make statements that are untrue is it's revisionist.
travesty.
We find ourselves actually revising revisionist history. Like, revise history if it's wrong. And if it's the revisionist history then is wrong, then we've got to look at it again. We've got to step back and say, wait a minute. I just attended a scholarly conference of the 16 top scholars on the subject in Plymouth just 2 weekends ago. So, really, really studying this stuff. And, it's not easy to penetrate to the truth, because how do you deal, for example, with oral history, the oral history of the native peoples, which is completely different from what is written by the white people. And they say the victors write the history. There weren't any victors back in those early days. It was friendship, and these observers, the quotes we've been reading, were actually journalists, those who kept journals and published stuff back in those days. They're the equivalent of our present-day reporters on the ground reporting the situation. They may not have understood it fully, but they weren't victors. So, okay. So let's show this clip, and then we'll end it at that point. And then we'll be open to questions for as long as anybody wants to talk. This is just kind of our passion these days.
Yeah, and so I just want to say one more thing about the Thanksgiving, since we're here on this, that we're a country divided right now because of this revisionist history, because Plymouth has become a symbol for the good and the bad. It's this conflicted place. So it's, in a way, it's good that it's come to one place and one day that we can all focus in, and the Native people can say, this is a national day of mourning. We're mourning the loss of our culture. We're mourning the loss of a way of life that came about as the result of the white man coming. And it's also a symbol of family, a symbol of plenty, a symbol of coming together. So it really symbolizes the choices we have to make today. Are we going to come together in our hearts and go forward into a higher way of being? Or are we going to stay separate and divided and victim-perpetrator and pointing fingers and demonizing one culture over another, when in fact the human race all cultures have been enmeshed in the lower aspects of humanity. It has nothing to do with skin color. The research we've been doing, we've discovered that the Native people were doing horrific things to each other long before the white man came. We were doing horrific things to each other long before we came over here. It has nothing to do with skin color. It's the human condition, and it's the evolution of consciousness, and the question is, where do we take it from here? So,
and here's a summary, the 10 common misbeliefs about the Pilgrims and the Indians. In present-day revisionist history, it's extraordinary how many people, for example, believe the Mayflower brought smallpox-infected blankets. That is utterly untrue. If anybody wants to discuss that in detail, we have the facts. The Pilgrims were welcomed with open arms. The first actual encounter they had was actually an attack. They were actually attacked by a group of Indians. Fortunately, nobody was killed. Then in the spring, they befriended each other. The Pilgrims would have starved the first winter if the Indians hadn't taken them in, fed them, and housed them. Not true. They didn't meet the Indians till the spring, and they had plenty of food, and they were all sick, and half of them died. Your food lasts much longer when your people are dead. And when you're sick, you just don't consume as much food. They had plenty. The Indians lived in universal peace and harmony until the white people came and did what we did to them. Yes, we did. The long-term effects have been horrific. We totally honor that. But the fact is the Indians were in anything but universal peace and harmony. The Iroquois Confederacy, their own history, states that the warring tribes and on and on. There was torture. There was just, I'm not going to go there. The Indians were egalitarian. They didn't have any leaders and chiefs. Well, in terms of the Iroquois democratic experiment, that's somewhat true. That's actually somewhat true. It's not true on the Eastern Seaboard. There they have royal families and an aristocracy that's so parallel to Europe, it's extraordinary. And today you can go to Plymouth and go to the royal cemetery of the Wampanoag people. They call themselves royals. They really operated that way. There was a hereditary situation, very much like Europe, so that's different. It is said that the Pilgrims came in as an invading army, raping and pillaging. I mean, I've heard it said that the first thing they did when they came ashore was to massacre 700 Indians and sit down for Thanksgiving dinner with the survivors. I mean,
Crazy what's going on out
crazy
there.
stories. And then there's a huge confusion between the Pilgrims and the Puritans. While they came from the same roots, they had very different attitudes. And the Puritans are actually a lot better than they've been painted as, but they were a hell of a lot stricter, with the emphasis on the hell, than the Pilgrims were. The Pilgrims were pretty liberal, and they never tried, for example, to convert the Indians to Christianity. And there are those who say, oh, they were convicts. They were expelled from England, and it was a shipload of convicts who were dumped here. Not true at all. True in Australia, and there were some convicts sent over much later. And finally, when we talk about King Philip's War, or Metacom, King Philip, his Indian name was Metacom, that the Pilgrims did this horrific thing to this innocent man who had just slaughtered 2,500 English people. You know, can you murder a murderer? He was, you know, I mean, so I would like to go back to the little clip and end on that. Is that okay?
Right.
'Cause-
Okay. We can do that. And so, but I want to just say one last thing, and that is
You
that
already said your one last thing,
the whole
darling.
thing has to do with the transformation of consciousness, the evolution of consciousness, that the story, as it's been told, has reflected our consciousness of the time. At first, it glorified the Pilgrim and left out the Indian. Then, with revisionist history, it's gone into this demonization of the Pilgrim and telling untruths. So that was our level of consciousness, which, as of 2012, things have shifted, and we can feel that energy shifting on the East Coast. Everyone was so locked into the victim-perpetrator model of us and them and all that, and that's shifted. And I'm sure you people here in Boulder are feeling that as well, because this huge shift of opening to the oneness of all of creation and oneness of all of humanity. So that's where we want to leave this thing, and that is that we are one. This oneness of the true nature of things is becoming evident to us all, and that very soon we will lay down the weapons of war and we will move into 1,000 years of peace.
Here's an image that I just love. Look at that. A man split down the middle, one half Pilgrim, one half Indian.
So
that
we
really
are
expresses the oneness. Now, let's go to the clip. 3 minutes, and we'll set you free, folks. How do you start it?
one. I don't know. How do you start it, Roger?
Hang on, we get a little hand going, I believe. And then just click on the hand. Yep, here we go. If there's audio. So this is the basic postcard for our film, the First 50 Years Project.
Is it going? No. So.
We'll get there.
A group of inspired individuals came here on the Mayflower in 1620. A few months later, they met with their first Native Americans, the Pokanoket Wampanoags. They signed a peace treaty at that time that the two inspired leaders, kept for 55 years.
As an American Indian, and I look back at these days of our first history, I just think it's a shame that the Plymouth paradigm did not endure.
We're raising money to make a documentary film, to write a screenplay for a feature film, and to sit down and write a historical novel called The First 50 Years, Freedom and Friendship at Plymouth Plantation.
It's America's origin story, and it's out of balance.
I think that the Pilgrims have been greatly misunderstood, especially as interpreted from the 20th century.
I'm Connie Baxter Marlow, and I'm descended from 5 of the Mayflower Pilgrims who landed here in Plymouth Harbor in 1620. We're at the grave of William Bradford, governor of Plymouth Colony, and an inspired leader. He and Massasoit, sachem of the Pokanoket Wampanoag Indians, also an inspired leader, kept their people in peace and friendship for 50 years, an extraordinary beginning of America.
It's my understanding that they were in harmony because that they were both on the same path in the spiritual side.
Think about it. Two exceedingly different cultures, one from Europe, one native here in the Americas, living together in harmony and friendship.
We're restoring balance to America's origin story here in Plymouth. It's been out of balance since it first started being told, when it honored the Pilgrims and virtually left out the Indians except for the Thanksgiving feast. Now it's out of balance in that it's demonizing the Pilgrims in an effort to honor the Indians. We're taking it to a high place of honor for both the Pilgrims and the Indian for their role in the beginnings of democracy and the American mind and spirit.
The Pilgrims landed right here in Plymouth, Massachusetts in November of 1620. We're 6 years away from 2020.
The landing of the Mayflower in 1620, along with the signing of the Mayflower Compact, brought the seeds of Western democracy to the Americas, where the Native Americans had been practicing a form of democracy for many centuries.
How can we help each other out using the concepts that were in place when the outsiders first came here? And it worked, and why don't we go back and looking at these things?
So that's it, folks. I would say happy Thanksgiving to all.
Thank you for coming.
And we're here, and if anybody'd like to continue the conversation on anything that we've brought up or any thoughts you might have, this is a research project on one level. You may well have information that we don't even know about yet, so thank you.
And go back to your People's History of the United States and check out what dear Howard Zinn has to say about this time.
Exactly. And are you considering a refutation of the points that Zinn makes?
Absolutely.
You know, it's so hard. There are so many points that could be refuted just because they are wrong. And how do you do that? I mean, part of Connie's idea is just, you know, as Bucky Fuller said, you know, don't try to fix the current paradigm, create a new one and the old one will fade away. I'm not sure that could be successful here because people are so profoundly enmeshed in this. Cher, the actress Cher, last Thanksgiving, put out a tweet to 2 million people about the Pilgrims and smallpox-infected blankets, which is, I mean, the epidemic was 1616 to 1618. Pilgrims arrive in 1620. Firstly, from that standpoint, impossible. The timing doesn't work, never mind all the rest of it.
It's such an absurdity that I choose not to engage with it.
Yeah.
Because it's over. Like I said, that level of consciousness is done. So why feed it?
Yeah.
Why attach to it? Because there's a whole new world coming, and it's coming from our hearts. And as I was talking to a Native American in New England, and I was saying, and she was very enmeshed in the victim-perpetrator thing, and going on, and I just said, well, but you know, it's your people and my people. We've got to come together. And she said, Connie, there's no more your people and my people. We're all one people. People living in my home are black, they're red, they're white. You know, she's married to a white man. Her children, you know, we just got to get over it.
And yet she's publishing a book on all this dark side. So it's at this point, I think we're in some difficult time where the Indians are desperate to be heard. You know, they've been sort of erased from history. They're still here. First and most important point, the native people are still here. Secondly, they have something really important to bring. And thirdly, they are desperate to be heard. And they're making themselves heard by saying some horrifically incorrect stuff, which certainly gets my attention, but, you know, in many ways you'd rather not.
Well, maybe the answer is don't believe anything and just start over.
Yeah, exactly.
How do you hit the reset button? Yeah.
Yeah, just go forward. So that's what our work is about. It's about moving us into a higher frequency where actually the laws are different in the higher frequencies. We're bringing some game-changing stuff to the table with our book. And it comes from the indigenous cosmology, that indigenous connection to what we call the conscious loving universe. And quantum science actually proving it now. So we actually can shift our behavior. We don't have to get up every morning and make decisions based on old information, which is what we're doing. We have some core beliefs that we're basing our every action on. And we're challenging those core beliefs and bringing 10 new assumptions. So we can move to this higher level, which the Earth is moving into a higher frequency. It's herself. So we just need to do the work to stay with this huge event that's the biggest event in the history of planet Earth, and that is this shift in consciousness and this shift into a higher frequency, a higher dimension.
400 years after the Mayflower. Significant moment that was, significant moment this is. Rob?
Yes.
How do you expect this would go if we were a room full of Native Americans?
We just did that in New England. We attended an event, what was it called, Connie?
The affiliated tribes of New England.
Right. So we addressed the affiliated tribes of New England, and we handed out postcards with this image on it. And it was wonderful and horrible, both. One of the lady chiefs got very, 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 very upset, yelled essentially at Connie, got up and stormed out. That was a part of it. And another part, and we happened to have with us a Mohawk peacemaker who had come down from Canada and come with us, and thank heaven for that, because at some point we just said, we are going to defer to Kevin Deere, and we got him to stand up, and he's a remarkable peacemaker. His life is about actually creating peace among the tribes, as the original peacemaker did 1,000 years ago in upstate New
And
York.
if you heard when I read that piece about the Iroquois Great Law, the condolence ceremony. Okay, this is huge. And that's what
Yeah,
Kevin is bringing.
that's what he does,
that
yeah.
condolence ceremony. Okay, listen to the pain, feel the pain, and let it go.
But the answer to your question, Rob, is that what we are saying is so contrary to what the majority of the East Coast Native people believe and have been told. One of the chief of the Pokanokets, the present-day chief of the Pokanokets, William Guy, stood up and spoke a lot and looked me in the eye as he spoke, with a strong implication that what I had to say was incorrect and he was putting me straight. And one of the things he said is, my grandmother would not lie to me. Okay, got it? My grandmother would not lie to me. Namely, oral history prevails. However, I know very well that my mother, my own mother, would not lie to me. And yet my mother told me some untrue things about my father's family. It was the best information she had. She didn't lie to me, but what she told me was untrue, innocently enough. I'm sure that Mr. Guy's grandmother, whatever she told him, told it from her best truth. But the problem is, a people that's been devastated, a people that's lost their language, their culture, their history, they don't know their own story. They really don't.
And oral history is malleable. The game of telephone. Things shift. You know, you say one thing long enough, and it's truth. Even today.
Today's politics, we know
have
you
as much
tell a
information
lie,
there and
tell a lie
written.
often enough, and it becomes the truth, right? We know that. So it's very challenging.
But
It's-
after this meeting, they came up and hugged us.
oh man, it was
And then we
so
were
warm.
invited there because we had been in contact and we'd been at their drum circle. They had read our book, some of them.
We go to their
And
powwows.
So
We're
we were
just
invited there, and one thing we've been told, you know, everyone has to express this pain. Let it be expressed. I've always called it the big zit theory. You know, we got to get it out. So we get it out so we can move forward. So don't try to, push it under the table. Let it out. And that's what was happening in this group. It was a trusted environment, and almost everyone came up afterwards and hugged us and said, whoa, you've been through the fire. You know, we'd like to talk more. We'd like to do more. But I want to tell you something else. The political situation out there amongst the tribes and amongst all the stories and everything is so convoluted that I promise you it will take an act of the divine to move us forward. Okay? And this is the origin of America. America is frozen, stuck in this place right now, I feel. It's an energetic blockage that sits there in Plymouth, in New England, that has just got to move somehow. And truly, as the spirit has been moving this whole evolutionary upward spiral, this is it. This needs to be supported by some force greater than all of us, because we can only go forward and bring information to the table and touch as many hearts as we can and carry on.
Yeah. So on Thursday, we'll see. We have friends who are going to be documenting the National Day of Mourning, the protest meeting at Plymouth. So I'm very interested to see whether what is being said has shifted from back in '05 and '06 when I first went, and I was shocked to hear the level of, I'm fine with anger about true events that really happened, but just spouting incorrect stuff, I don't think it serves anybody. So we'll see. It would be really nice to see that 2012 actually did signal a shift, and that we've turned the corner, and that the native peoples of New England are coming out with up with a more positive perspective. I would love that.
And we've
Secondly, I just wanted you to know that we were on the radio in Boston on Saturday, so we're presenting this perspective on the radio remotely, on a radio show, and we'll be on again on Thanksgiving afternoon on the radio in the context of that protest. A lot of stuff is coming in from the protest. There's a day-long radio broadcast, and we're going to be featured on that as well to present this, firstly, a positive. I'm sure there are people who think we're anti-Indian. I'm sure there are people who think we're pro-English. I don't think we're anti or pro anything other than pro-truth and pro-moving forward. And it's a painful situation there right now. That's, yes, the subsequent history has been horrible. Can we, and the question is, the big question, is can we return to that precious gem at the founding of America, at the heart, that half century of success, of freedom, of friendship, of peace? Can we return to that and let that be the focus instead of all the other terrible stuff that happened later and in other places and all around?
Any other questions or thoughts? Well, we're thankful for Howard Zinn, actually, because the Indians have been putting out some pretty horrific stuff. And to have it be a white guy who's been in the college curriculums and everything else, and who has definitely played a major role in this revisionist history, demonizing Pilgrims in English, etc., is a real gift. So we don't have to be singling out, we can just, it was a condition of the level of consciousness, and now
We
it's.
can't even agree on the history of Vietnam in our
Yeah.
lifetime.
Yeah, it's very difficult.
100 years?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I think,
This is a nice, for me, this is a nice, great program in following up for the talk about the archaeologist at CU on the Viking. Work on Viking archaeology, Viking settlement archaeology, and Greenland, I think, or Newfoundland up there. And some of what he said, I think, was referred to this a little slightly, but not. But it meant no conflict at all.
Oh, great. Great. Well, we're anxious, anybody has anything to add to this or perspectives, we're more than open to hearing.
I grew up in Minnesota, and on the north shore of Lake Superior, there is a tremendous amount of archaeological verification of the Vikings going all the way up the St. Lawrence Seaway and settling for a substantial period of time on the north shore of Lake Superior in what is now Minnesota.
really?
It's
Oh,
extremely well established.
I did not know that, Bud.
Oh, yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's in the archaeological records, and they have tremendous artifacts that are absolutely irrefutably grounded in Viking history.
Well, I think the archaeologists are a little bit skeptical of some of that, but I'm just trying to recall what I heard. Were you at the same program that me spoke at Old Main?
No.
So once again, thank you. And we're here and we're open to, is there,
No, I was just going to say that in the 10th century, in the Viking culture, they had the very first democracy on the planet, which was Thingvellir. We might add that to your list.
okay, thank you.
You can
Thank
go
you.
there today and see
Yeah.
where they met.
You know, and one of the puzzles here is that there's so much present day anger and pain and shame and blame and guilt around this situation, focused on the Mayflower Pilgrims, who were the most innocent people imaginable.
we call it a case of mistaken identity.
It's extraordinary.
Because
How-
they were the closest to the Indian of anybody, any white person before or since. They could actually make it rain. They were that connected to nature. They could make it rain. And the Indians would say, well, how come when you make it rain, it comes down in nice little, even, gentle rain, and when we make it rain, it comes down out in a downpour.
washes our
this
crops
is in
away.
historical record. Okay.
But what I wanted to say is that, to me, it's quite extraordinary. These are events of 400 years ago, and it's still so present today, right now. It's very powerfully present, and there's all of these powerful present-day feelings. There's a real sociological relevance to what we're doing, and wondering whether anything is really to be done to set this at rest, because little Indian children, little white children are being taught stuff in the school curriculums right now that is horrifically untrue. Just as an exercise, if anybody wants to remember the phrase, the real, capital R-E-A-L, the real Thanksgiving, if you Google that, you'll come across something that was written by somebody named Susan Bates. We don't know who she is, but it's horrible. And it's horrifically untrue. And this is the kind of thing that's seriously out there in school curricula now as we revise history. So the revising of revisionist history is challenging. And finally, I think I have Viking ancestors. And they, I understand, were wild and oftentimes murderous people. Am I guilty about that? I'm not. It's a fact. If that's true, fine. I'm not going to race around looking for redress or anything. I was born in England, a country that was invaded and invaded and invaded, and then this country was invaded. That's human history. The migrations and the invasions of humanity, and they do leave behind their painful heritages that we have to deal with to this day.
And so here's a little revising of revisionist history. Massasoit in 1623 was dying. Was it 1623?
1622.
He was dying. The Indians
1622.
1622. The Indians sent word to the Pilgrims, your friend is dying. Edward Winslow, goes into Pokanoket country, 40 miles, to say his goodbyes to Massasoit. He brings a conserve, a compote, an herbal remedy, and gives it to Massasoit. Massasoit recovers, okay? And Winslow's there scraping his tongue and going around and scraping everybody else's tongue who has this problem. Massasoit says, oh, would you go out and kill some fowl and make me your amazing soup? So Winslow goes out and makes the soup.
English chicken soup.
English
It heals
chicken
it all.
soup, okay? And so while he's there, he's living with Combatant, who's another chief of the Wampanoag, and who doesn't like the Pilgrims much, who has always been agitating to take them out. And they're living together, and during this period, and so the Winslow's giving thanks to God before he eats, and all that, and Combatant says, what's up with that? What are you doing? And Winslow says, well, we're thanking God for these bountiful food, and they have a discussion about their religious beliefs, and Combatant says, what you call God, we call Khitan. We have just about the same beliefs that you do, except one thing we don't agree with, and that is the one wife. And then Combatant says, he asks him, would you do the same for me if I got this sick? And Winslow says, of course. And Combatant then says, tell me, Winslow, how is it that you dare come so far alone into Indian country? And Winslow says, where there is love, there is no fear, and mine heart is so upright towards you, I am fearless to come amongst you. Okay? That sets a whole other tone. It just gives us a sense of the heart of what was going on. So, a little revising of revisionist history.
And by returning to original source material.
Yeah. What was their intent? What was the behavior? What was going on? Boots on the ground. And what came out of it? The American mind and spirit is well recognized that by 1776, The American mind was different from the European mind because of the interaction with the Native Americans, okay? Not only on how we think and what we did, but our warfare. You know, that whole English thing with lining up and shooting each other from you know, that whole thing where they lined up. Then what they learned from the Indians was guerrilla warfare, you know, go into the woods, camouflage yourself, and, you know, that whole thing. It shifted everything. And this book, Bradford's Indian book, really gives you a sense of this interchange, this amazing interchange.
Thank you.
Written by an Indian. So, you know, there's just a lot to be known and to be made known to us all.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, well,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Stick around and talk if you like.
Thanks for being a great audience, and we're here as long as anybody would like to keep talking.